Hi, everyone. I'm Vladimir Dutit. We are watching all the news happening in the United States and around the world. If you join me every morning at 10 o'clock in the morning, you know what I'm going to tell you. These are screens coming into the CBS News Broadcast Center from all of our stations and affiliates around the country. If it's happening out there, we're going to bring it to you live right here in Studio 55. Let's begin. Overnight, President Trump orders a freeze on all federal grants and loans, a move that could impact millions of Americans as trillions of dollars in government spending is put on hold. But what in his memo is specific as to what comes next? We're going to tell you. And across the country, some immigrants are reportedly in hiding amid the president's immigration crackdown and sweeping deportations. We're tracking the very latest as the raids and the arrests tick up. Plus, a new Chinese AI startup is gaining major traction. We'll explain what DeepSeek is and why it's already shaking up the tech industry and Wall Street. This is CBS News 24/7. We begin this hour with a flurry of moves from the White House. The Trump administration has paused all federal grants and loans. While it will not pause Social Security or Medicare benefits, there is a temporary hold on all programs related to DEI, the Green New Deal, and foreign aid assistance. The administration is also moving to gut diversity programs and set up a potential ban on transgender service members. The newly confirmed Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says there are more executive orders coming. So I want to bring in CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe for more on this. So, Ed, just break down all the news, because it does seem as if there is a flood of information coming in, and it's really hard to keep up with it. So break it down for our audience.
As I was just saying to your producer, Vlad, you have screens, we have reams of paperwork that have been issued overnight here at the White House. Let's work through these 4 executive orders regarding military policy. First, we'll get the less controversial ones out of the way. Big idea he's had for a while that dates back to the Reagan years, establishing some kind of iron dome protective system over the skies of the United States, just like Israel has. He'd like to see plans on how to do that in 60 days. That's one. Second one, reinstating service members discharged under the military's COVID-19 vaccination mandate. About 8,000 members of the military left, were discharged, voluntarily separated over the course of the pandemic because they refused to take the vaccine. Since that mandate was rescinded in 2023, about 110 of them have rejoined the ranks. The president saying in his executive order that any of them who want to come back can be restored with full back pay, benefits, bonus payments, or compensation. So there's that one. That's a big campaign pledge fulfilled, and of course was a big concern of a lot of his supporters that vaccine mandates were getting in the way of living our lives over the course of the pandemic. The one that is raising real concerns today for a lot of people in the ranks and those that love and care for them is the ban on transgender troops. Could apply to thousands, untold number of people. But why this is different than the first time he put one in place during his first administration is that it goes farther in the language here to suggest that these people are mentally and physically unqualified to serve. For example, it says here in the executive order, longstanding Defense Department policy says that ensures that service members are, quote, free of medical conditions or physical defects that may reasonably be expected to require excessive time lost from duty for necessary treatment or hospitalization. They've argued, those opposed to having transgender troops in the ranks, that the medical requirements needed to transition from one gender to another could potentially hold them up and make them unavailable for military service. And he writes later in this order, a man's assertion that he is a woman and his requirement that others honor this falsehood is not consistent with the humility and selflessness required of a service member. So while it officially orders the Pentagon to start coming up with ways to potentially remove them, it all but says they're going to get kicked out. This will be challenged by transgender rights activists and by others who argue that it's not as bad as this order would make it seem, and that these people are able to serve, take time for their medical appointments outside of their service time or the deployment orders, and generally just don't think that this will be necessary. So that's a big one. The other one, consistent with some other changes he's made across the rest of the federal government, including in that funding memo last night, ends all diversity, equity, inclusion programs across the Pentagon, essentially arguing that for the last several years, the Pentagon has been a little too focused on such things and not necessarily on war fighting. You heard Pete Hegseth talk about that a lot in his confirmation hearing, that they're going to try to refocus the military just on military issues and less that other stuff. That, too, may potentially get challenged, but is a sign of the campaign promises he's trying to keep and making sure that they apply to all departments.
So, Ed, as you know, this afternoon, the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, will hold that first press briefing. We know the president likes to be his own press secretary. He has been taking questions from you, the members of the press, since his inauguration. But what can we expect today?
Well, we can expect that she is scheduled to address reporters at about 1 o'clock Eastern time. Tune in. I suspect we're going to have live coverage of that. As I was walking out here, they were setting up the flat screen televisions on either side of the lectern, which would suggest she might have some visual aids to share with reporters in the room. Leavitt is very well known to those who watch Fox or Newsmax, less known to others because she has either declined or just does not appear on other news outlets to discuss the president's agenda, the president-elect's agenda, the candidate's agenda back in the day. She, of course, also a former Trump 1.0 press aide who's seen a bit of a promotion since then, ran for Congress a few years ago unsuccessfully from her home state of New Hampshire. And we'll see to what extent she's able to answer detailed questions about, for example, that funding memo that was issued overnight, these orders and changes at the Pentagon, and give us any sense of the president's schedule, calls with foreign leaders, the typical kinds of questions we've asked of previous press secretaries. It'll be a first crack at that today, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, because Ed, as you point out, there's so many questions specifically related to that funding order that aren't clear. For example, how small businesses will be affected, how people who are receiving fellowships and grants will be affected. So I'm really looking forward to that 1 p.m. press briefing, and I know you'll be there. Thank you very much, Ed O'Keefe from the White House this morning for us. Appreciate it. Okay, let's bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns. So, Caitlin, those new executive orders last night followed a wide-ranging speech that the president gave at the GOP's annual retreat in Florida. Give us some of the highlights.
Yeah, Vlad, good to see you. Well, House Republicans are meeting in Miami, and they actually met at Trump's golf course in a ballroom that is named after the president. And that kind of gets you a behind-the-scenes look at how close this House Republican conference is with the president. This was a very celebratory atmosphere, and on the agenda is the president's agenda, specifically how they're going to get through tax cuts and other tax-related items on the economy through this Congress, along with immigration and other items on the president's agenda. But what's really interesting, Vlad, just listening to your conversation with Ed there about executive orders, the question I have on this end of Pennsylvania Avenue is how Republicans are assessing the president's use of executive orders and executive authority. We're really seeing kind of the president flood the zone with executive action. That's been applauded by Republican lawmakers here on Capitol Hill, but it also kind of runs counter to the conservative argument that, presidents shouldn't have all of the power. So that's something that we're kind of tracking here as we go forward, not only the response to these specific orders, but kind of how this Congress sees itself in a situation where the president is trying to go at it alone in a lot of respects.
That's such an interesting point that you raise, Caitlin, because on one hand, Republicans prefer small government and they prefer all the power to not be concentrated in the hands of the chief executive. They want the power concentrated in the states and localities where the citizens reside. So that's sort of interesting. The other thing that's interesting is, of course, if a Democrat was signing a bunch of executive orders this early in the presidency, you can be sure that Republicans would not be happy about that for the reasons we just stated. So I'm just sort of curious, given that Democrats are on their heels and haven't really quite figured out how to counteract these policies that the president is hoping to implement, what you're hearing from folks on the ground.
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic, Vlad, and we saw this in previous administrations. It's always the party out of power that raises the alarm bells about this. But what's interesting is that Democrats really don't have a kind of unified leader of the party right now. They're still kind of in the wilderness trying to figure things out. I mean, case in point, in just about an hour or so, some Democratic leaders are going to hold a press conference announcing a resolution to essentially talk about how upset they are with the president's pardon of January 6th offenders. That is a little bit of a delayed response and doesn't really have much teeth. The pressure that they're able to put on Republicans, isn't really as profound. But the big question we have today, and what I will likely hear from Democrats, is this questioning of the president's executive authority when it comes to halting that federal aid. This is a situation where at least lawmakers on the Democratic side of the aisle want to assert their authority on these measures. There are likely going to be legal challenges to a lot of what the president does, but that's also something that has been part of his MO over the years, right? I mean, put a lot of things out there and see what sticks. But by and large, you have Republicans here on Capitol Hill unified around the president. And we're also likely to see that, Vlad, later this week when we have some big confirmation hearings on the Senate side for some of his more controversial picks, RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel.
So let's talk about the Democrats. Two interesting nuggets for our viewers. We just learned of a major turnover for Democrats in the state of Michigan, as Senator Gary Peters announces that he won't seek re-election. That's sort of interesting. But up on the calendar, Caitlin, as you know, on February 1st is the election for the Democratic National Committee chairman. Jamie Harrison is saying he's not going to seek re-election. There's a lot of Democrats suggesting that to be able to counter the president's message, as it specifically relates to Democrats, they need somebody who's a good counter-puncher. They haven't seen that lately. So what are you hearing, not only about what's happening in Michigan, but what could potentially take place on February 1st?
Yeah, as we're talking about who the leader of the Democratic Party is, this race on for the DNC chair will be at least one step in that direction. Now, the DNC chair is responsible for party messaging. You'll probably see them on TV a lot, punching back at the Republicans. But what that job really is about is money and infrastructure. That doesn't sound all that exciting, but that is so important when you're talking about building up the party, building up the bench, building up those state parties, having a big, robust infrastructure for Democrats to play at the state level and get them up to the federal level, and also have the money to be able to counterpunch on this programming. So that will be one step. But we're also looking at that Senate seat that you mentioned in Michigan. This is a huge deal, Vlad, because this is a state, a key battleground state in Michigan. Trump just won it in November, and this is an open seat in the midterms. And as we know, the Republicans control the Senate, but it's still a pretty slim margin. So could they expand that majority? That remains to be seen. But that also gives an indication about how Democrats may feel about their current circumstances.
Yeah, Michigan's so interesting, Caitlin, as you point out, because, yes, Donald Trump did win that state handily. But we, of course, as you know, spoke to Governor Gretchen Whitmer yesterday on CBS Mornings. And she is an incredibly popular governor in that state. So it really will be interesting to see what happens with Senator Peters' seat. I'm looking forward to that discussion happening all across the state of Michigan. Caitlin Huey-Burns for us on the Hill. Love to have it. Thank you very much, Caitlin. All right, President Trump's mass deportation plan is stoking fear in immigrant communities throughout the United States, with several raids and arrests reported since the start of the Trump administration last week. Departments of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem posted a new video of what she says was an arrest in New York City. She wrote in an X post that an ICE enforcement operation led to the arrest of a person charged with kidnapping, assault, and burglary. CBS News and national correspondent Ian Lee is live from Chicago, where ICE raids unraveled. That's probably not the right word, where they took place on Sunday. Ian, let's talk about this. Ford, Kraft, Heinz, and PepsiCo are just some of Chicago's biggest companies in the region. How are the businesses and communities reacting to the arrests and the detainments?
Oh, Vlad, if I were to sum it up in a word, anxious. These are companies that are worried that their workforce could be arrested, could be deported, that it could affect their operations, it could raise the cost of food. And this just isn't in Chicago, but across the country. There is this concern that the United States is entering some uncharted waters, that this workforce could be deported. And what does that mean for companies that do rely on immigrants? Now, there is a proactive measure that they're hoping for, too. These companies are calling for the Trump administration and members of Congress to come up with a bipartisan bipartisan solution that people who may be in the country illegally, but who don't have any other criminal convictions, who are holding down jobs, that there could be some sort of pathway for them to have citizenship or at least be in the country legally, and so that it doesn't affect their operations.
Ian, one thing that I'm curious about is, are officials making sure, at this point at least, because that is the plan, at least is the way we understand it from Tom Homan, which is to go after violent criminals, people who have a criminal record, as opposed to, someone who's holding down a job, paying taxes, perhaps even has children that are American citizens. How are we able to assess if they're doing exactly as indicated at the top levels of Customs and Border?
Yeah, Vlad, ICE has been releasing the numbers of people that they've been detaining on Sunday. It was around 900 yesterday, just shy of 1,200. They're not really releasing the details of each individual case. We don't know how many people, for say, in Chicago have been arrested. But we do know, we have sources telling CBS News that they are going after people who have warrants out for their arrest. We heard from the mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson, saying he's fine with them going after people who have criminal convictions. And Tom Homan was in Chicago over the weekend, and he was overseeing these operations. And so it does seem, at least for the moment, that they are going after people who do have those criminal records, Vlad.
All right, Ian Lee for us in Chicago. Ian, thank you, my friend. Appreciate it. Attorneys for a homeowner whose house was destroyed in the Eaton wildfire are suing Southern California Edison for allegedly causing the fire. They say video from a gas station on January 7th shows electrical arcing and sparks on a transmission tower falling onto a dry hillside. Minutes later, the hillside began to burn. The Eaton fire has destroyed more than 9,000 structures and killed at least 17 people. Southern California Edison says there's no evidence its equipment started the fire. Let's bring in CBS News Philadelphia meteorologist Grant Gilmore with the first look at the national forecast. Hey, Grant.
Hey, good morning, Vlad. Keeping an eye on a series of clipper systems moving through the Midwest out of Canada into the Northeast today. Already produced a few snow squall warnings in parts of eastern Pennsylvania this morning. More gusty conditions coming with these clipper systems as they drop in out of southern Canada today into the day tomorrow, bringing gusty winds and series of bursts of actually pretty heavy snowfall. Some places could see up to a foot of snow, but those gusty conditions, even outside of some of the snow squalls, could be up to around 50 miles per hour with sustained winds around 15 to 20 miles per hour. So the combination between the snow and those gusty conditions could reduce the visibility on the road. We'll have to watch out for some minor travel impacts. Elsewhere around the country, we'll dry across the southeast, got some showers and a few thunderstorms across the southern plains. Mild conditions across the central United States. We'll talk more about this here in a bit, but look at this. High temperatures in Sioux Falls around 52 degrees, and then watching a little bit of snow moving across the desert southwest. Vlad, back to you for now.
All right. Thank you very much, Grant. We'll talk to you a little bit later. Yeah. A new Chinese startup is sending shockwaves through Washington and Wall Street. Coming up, what to know about DeepSeek AI. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Ukraine says at least 8 people have been injured in Russia's latest overnight aerial attack across the country. As the fighting rages on, our Holly Williams traveled with a group of Ukrainian paramedics as they ferry injured troops away from the front lines. Watch.
We are in the back of an ambulance that ferries soldiers from stabilization points or makeshift medical centers close to the front line here in eastern Ukraine to hospitals. It's run by an international aid group known as MOAS. They actually operate a fleet of 50 ambulances here in Ukraine all along the front line, which is around 600 miles long. Now, this soldier was hit by shelling. He has a shrapnel wound to his head and he is unconscious and on ventilation. This war in Ukraine has now been raging for nearly 3 years, sparked by Vladimir Putin's invasion of this country, and it is widely accepted that there have been hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. Ukraine's defense, in the eyes of some, has been nothing short of miraculous. Russia, with the second or third most powerful military in the world, has only succeeded in taking around 20% of Ukraine's territory. But the demographics are against Ukraine. Russia has around 3 times the population of Ukraine. And that is one reason why so many Ukrainians tell us that no matter what happens with negotiations or a ceasefire, they need a continuing supply of American weapons.
Holly Williams with that incredible debrief, and you can catch much more of Holly's reporting on the CBS Evening News tonight at 6:30 p.m. Eastern. Okay, let's talk about the sudden rise of an artificial intelligence company called DeepSeek that sent the U.S. stock market into a frenzy yesterday. Tech stocks hit a record low, finishing down over 3%, and the S&P 500 finishing down around 1.5%. DeepSeek created an AI model in less time and at a lower cost than American companies. So let's bring in CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady in Studio 55 live to talk about this. This is so interesting, Kelly. So explain it, because I think people are trying to understand why, for example, NVIDIA was down so much yesterday and why so many millions of Americans were signing up to download DeepSeek. What's going on?
Okay, so DeepSeek has created essentially a better, cheaper chatbot that uses less energy. So the tech analysts that are looking at this are saying, look, this is as good as OpenAI's ChatGPT, but it can actually explain its logic and reasoning before it gives you the answer. Now, why NVIDIA was down is that this chatbot and this AI model behind it was allegedly created with 2,000 chips versus tens of thousands of chips that US models make, and NVIDIA is a chip maker. And so the investors are saying, well, hold on a second. If you can make a comparable AI model with less chips, that really undermines potentially NVIDIA's business model.
So you no doubt saw the Jon Stewart clip where he sort of jokes, hey, did you realize that the Chinese could make it better and cheaper than the United States? But it goes beyond that because there are some national security concerns as well.
That's right. And I will highlight, there are analysts saying, well, we aren't 100% sure that they did make this for $6 million versus $100 million
You basically have to take the Chinese government's word.
You have to take their word. There are national security concerns because this is not just about a chatbot. If China gets ahead of the U.S. in terms of AI development, we are talking about defense technology, surveillance technology. So there's really a lot of concerns there that this AI race, it really could be another Cold War space race. The other thing that I'll highlight that I thought was interesting, if you have users and companies turning to this Chinese chatbot, there's ideological concerns as well. It doesn't highlight that the Tiananmen Square massacre existed. You can ask it questions about that. So there's an element of censorship in there.
Right. The Chinese, every Chinese company, if the Chinese government requests any information, any data, they have by law to give it up to the Chinese government. The other thing that I was wondering about, Kelly, and I'll tap your investment experience on Wall Street, what we saw yesterday, does that represent a buying opportunity? If you're out there and you're looking at the tech space today, are you saying to yourself, look, this was a blip because this was a seismic shock to the system, but I still love some of these companies and I see an opportunity here?
It is, I would say, and I can't give investment advice,
we don't give
but
investment
in my
advice here.
humble opinion,
Yes.
it is a buying opportunity because none of these companies are going to say, oh, we lost the AI race, we're not going to invest. They're going to invest more. They are going to try and catch up, exceed if we are indeed behind. And we're about to go into earnings tomorrow. We are going to hear from Meta and a number of other companies. And so there could also be a boost in those stocks if they do report well.
So yes, getting on the phone with my advisor right after we finish the show. Kelly O'Grady, always great to have you here in Studio 55. Thank you very much. All right, the acting attorney general fired at least a dozen Justice Department officials who worked on the special counsel's investigations into Donald Trump. What the administration is saying about the shakeup. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. This morning, the village of East Palestine has reached a settlement with Norfolk Southern nearly 2 years after the train derailment that shook the community. Plumes of toxic smoke overtook the village, and it took months to clean up. Residents still have health concerns about the contamination from the air and the water. The village says the settlement is for $22 million. It also recognizes prior payments from Norfolk Southern that have helped to improve facilities in and around the village. All right, analysts say the president's new batch of executive orders targeting the military could reshape America's armed forces. Trump has eliminated diversity measures, ordered a new defense missile system, and demanded the Pentagon come up with a new policy for transgender service members, all within 30 days. Charlie D'Agata is CBS News' senior national security correspondent, and he joins me now live from the Pentagon. So let's talk about what you're hearing from your sources at the Pentagon, Charlie, with regards to these new policies.
Yeah, Vlad, you know, I've got this printed written statement and I should tape it up somewhere because this is the official line from the Pentagon, and this came out before the executive orders were issued. The Department of Defense is fully committed to carrying out the orders from our commander-in-chief and is doing so immediately under his leadership. To the point. That's the official line. And that has to do with sending troops to the border, has to do with transgender issues, it has to do with DEI issues. In terms of cost and the people you're speaking to, it all comes down to implementation, because you had pointed out there, right? This is not like an instant ban on transgender. This is, hey, DOD, come up with a plan to implement that. And that's where the devils are in the details. First of all, it's hard getting a grip on numbers of transgender individuals serving in active and duty reserves. Most estimates put it at roughly 15,000. That's from a UCLA study. So they don't have hard numbers. It's not like a box that they tick. And it's difficult because not every transgender service member has self-identified. Some have gone through the transition process before enlisting. There's not a box to tick for that. So it's hard to get the numbers. Now, in terms of cost, it is significant. An advocacy group back in 2017 put that cost at $960 million, and they derived that number. I looked at the study by essentially multiplying the number of estimated transgender troops by the cost of recruiting and training their replacement. A spokesperson for the advocacy group said, look, transgender service members, hard to say, have been serving for almost 10 years. They filled every critical role in the military. They go to war zones, high-stake missions, demonstrating their ability to strengthen unit cohesion and morale.
So, Charlie, as you know, the president also ordered the reinstatement of service members who were kicked out of the military for refusing the COVID vaccine, and he's promised full back pay. Now, as Ed O'Keefe explained earlier, the President Biden rescinded that order back in 2023. Some service members did rejoin. So I'm trying to understand what the difference is here.
Well, Vlad, those are all good questions. So we checked with individual services because that's where the numbers lie. Research from our colleague, Ellie Watson. She found that 8,200 service members were discharged for refusing to follow that mandate. Since that mandate was rescinded by the Biden administration, 110 service members rejoined. And that's prior to any executive orders by the Trump administration. Let me repeat that. So of 8,000 service members discharged, 110 came back. It might be different this time because not only is back pay on offer, but those personnel will be returned to their original rank according to this new directive. Again, it's all going to come down to the implementation because usually military back pay is offset by what the individuals would have earned in the civilian world. But if every service member were to come back with back pay, and that's a big if, that would cost several hundred thousands of dollars.
All right. The devil's in the details, as you say. Charlie Daggett reporting from the Pentagon for us this morning. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, Vlad.
All right, more than a dozen Department of Justice employees who worked on the criminal prosecutions of President Trump have been fired. Those who worked on Special Counsel Jack Smith's team were targeted. I want to bring in Justice Department reporter Jake Rosen to talk about the future of the department. So the question, Jake, is could these fired prosecutors challenge the terminations? Many of them are long-term civil servants who've been a part of the DOJ, serving multiple administrations, both Republican and Democrat. What are you hearing?
Well, Vlad, it's certainly possible that they would, although we saw from the email that has been reported by other news outlets that was sent to these employees, basically saying, because of your investigations of Donald Trump, basically you're not welcome here, and we don't trust your judgment going forward. Now, to officially fire some of these civil servants, many of these people, like you pointed out, are exactly that. They're not political appointees of the Department of Justice. You have to prove basically that they're not doing their job to the capability that they need to be doing it to, and that there's some kind of cause to be fired. Now, in a letter sent today by Jamie Raskin, you'll remember him from those January 6 hearings, a loud vocal member and opponent of Donald Trump in the House, and he's the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee. He wrote a letter today that was just published saying that he wants to see evidence from the Department of Justice and the interim leaders there before Pam Bondi potentially gets confirmed, showing that they actually went through the mechanisms of making sure that these people can actually be fired and didn't just blanket fire them, although we know from what Donald Trump said on the campaign trail forever. He basically pledged to do this on day one once Jack Smith officially took over. So to challenge that would be very difficult for these people to do.
Just to be clear, Jake, are those folks still in their jobs today, or have they had to leave the positions while this all gets sorted out?
Our understanding is that they basically were terminated as of yesterday, although we'll have to keep reporting out that today.
All right. So as Trump positions close allies like Kash Patel, for example, who's been nominated to be the FBI director, how does he, or what is he saying about how he plans to end what he calls the weaponization of the federal government? Those are the president's words.
Well, it's certainly possible, Vlad, that they do the same thing in the FBI, and they find the FBI agents who were working on whether it's the raid of Mar-a-Lago that Donald Trump has pointed to as really one of the moments that made him know that he needed to get into the campaign and run and basically cleanse the Department of Justice, cleanse the FBI, and purge them of people who he sees as disloyal to his worldview and his loyalists. It's very possible that what we saw yesterday happens there, but it's also possible that what we've seen in the Department of Justice also happens in a different way, which is reassigning career bureaucrats, some of these people who have worked for 20 or 30 years in the Department of Justice, in the FBI, moving them to Donald Trump's mission, which is immigration. So what we've seen is basically mass resignations in the DOJ as well, by moving people from their longtime jobs to new jobs, focusing on eliminating sanctuary cities and going after cities that are not helping with the Trump administration's deportation plans. So again, you can either fire them or you can basically transfer them and force them to resign or reevaluate their career prospects.
All right. Jake Rosen for us, reporting from Washington this morning. Thanks, Jake. All right. The world's largest iceberg is heading towards an Arctic island that is packed with baby penguins and seals. Scientists warn the massive ice wall is on a collision course with the remote island, putting the animals in danger. The island of South Georgia is crucial for wildlife breeding in the South Atlantic. The iceberg, which is said to be 3 times the size of New York City, could reach the island in the next 2 to 4 weeks. All right, let's bring in CBS News Philadelphia meteorologist Grant Gilmore with another look at the national forecast. Hi, Grant.
What's up, Vlad? Hey, guys, we're keeping a close eye on a couple of Clipper systems moving through the upper Midwest out of really Canada and moving into the Northeast over the next couple of days. It'll bring some gusty winds, some reduced visibility because of the snow. We got one of the Clipper systems actually moving through the Northeast right now, with another one on the way as it drops in out of eastern Minnesota, upper peninsula of Michigan into northern Wisconsin. These are going to come with some reduced visibilities because of that periodic heavy snowfall. Let me show you a look at the forecast here as we make our way through the next couple of days. But the gusty winds also, we saw some wind gusts with the first Clipper system around 60 miles per hour. So it was a pretty potent system. It's moving east. Here's the next system dropping in out of Marquette right now, out of Lake Superior. Watch here as that low pressure system quickly drops to the south and east as we go through the next 24 hours. Some wind gusts with this system could be up around 50 miles per hour. Some snow totals could be between 7 to 12 inches, especially downwind of some of the Great Lakes, and those reduced visibilities could drop that visibility down to less than a mile. So if you're out driving around and one of those snow squalls moves through, it could make for at least temporarily treacherous travel. Here's the forecast for the snow totals as we go into tomorrow afternoon and evening. They're downwind of Lake Erie, 6 to 8 inches of snow. You head into upstate New York, 12 potentially. That's a foot of snow before these series of Clipper systems begin to wind down. That'll taper off by Wednesday night. In the meantime, relatively mild conditions across the central United States. We'll get to that in just a second, but dry down into the south and east. A little showers moving through Texas this morning. Some rain and snow in northern Arizona into New Mexico. But let's talk about these mild temperatures. Temperatures last week were well below normal. This week, well above normal. Look at Minneapolis today, 44 degrees. That's 20 degrees above normal. And these relatively mild conditions will continue through most of the week. Tomorrow, temperatures in the upper 30s in Minneapolis, 63 in Memphis. That's 11 degrees warmer than normal. As we go into Thursday, temperatures Detroit around 44, 13 degrees above normal. And that mild trend continues all the way through Friday. In fact, that might even continue into the weekend for some across the eastern half of the United States. Vlad, back to you.
All right, Grant, thank you very much. We'll check in with you a little bit later. Scores of displaced Palestinians are returning home to Gaza as a fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas holds. This as negotiators discuss the next stage of the deal. We'll have more on that next. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. Thousands of displaced Palestinians are continuing to return to their homes in northern Gaza after 15 months of fighting. And as a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas continues to hold, Jordanian helicopters have begun delivering aid into the enclave. Weira Davis from our partners at the BBC is following the latest from Jerusalem, and he joins me now to talk about it. Weira, thousands of Gazans are now returning to their homes, but the question remains, what are they coming back to?
Yeah, initially there are jubilant scenes as families are reunited. People who've been several times over during the course of this war forced to leave their places of accommodation. They finally get to go back to where they come from northern Gaza. And the euphoria of being able to go back there as the Israeli roadblocks are lifted is met with the reality, according to UN aid agencies, that many of the homes, particularly in Gaza City and in the towns and cities of northern Gaza, are no longer there. There's very little infrastructure, very little power supplies. We know the normal infrastructure you'd expect, like schools and hospitals, are largely no longer standing. So yes, there's the euphoria of getting home, families being reunited, but the reality on the ground in Gaza is getting apparent day by day.
So what more can you tell us about the aid that is now finally flowing into Gaza?
Well, aid for the people of Gaza was a very critical part of the ceasefire deal, that brought a temporary end to the fighting, the release of hostages being held by Hamas and other militant groups, but also to address the almost 2 million people in Gaza who are in a desperate humanitarian situation, the kind of things we've just been talking about, and the provision of hundreds of trucks worth of aid every day. Over the past few months, simply not enough aid has been getting through. There are issues with malnutrition and starvation, but because of the ceasefire, the amount of aid has multiplied over recent days, both across the border through Egypt and the border crossings like Kerem Shalom between Israel and Gaza, and also, as you alluded to in your introduction, aid drops from the Jordanians have begun today by helicopter. They look good, and it's very important from a diplomatic perspective, but they don't bring as much aid in as is needed, and the majority of that is being brought in by trucks on the ground.
And as the ceasefire continues to hold, what do we know about when talks will begin to negotiate on the second phase?
Well, this is the key thing. This initial 6-week ceasefire has to hold, say, international aid agencies and governments that have got a stake in what's happening. If there's to be a lasting peace, if the remaining hostages are to be released, and there's to be some sort of solution to what is happening in Gaza. The big fear is that after this initial phase 1, this 6 weeks, that there will be a resumption of the fighting. Certainly there are hardline members of the Israeli government who want to do that because they say Hamas is not yet fully defeated. So on Monday next week, we should get the talks starting about how to get to that second phase of a more permanent ceasefire, the release of the remaining hostages, and this plan for a future in Gaza. But there are real concerns, I think, here in the region that after this 6-week first phase, that we won't necessarily see the ceasefire continue. Weira Davis, handing back to you in the studio.
All right, Weira, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Violence is escalating in the Congo. The UN is describing it as a mass panic among the 2 million people living there. Rwanda-backed rebels are clashing with the military in the eastern part of the country and now claim to have taken the city of Goma. And the U.S. Embassy in Kinshasa has advised citizens to shelter in place. Earlier on the CBS Morning News, West Africa bureau chief at the New York Times, Ruth McLean, spoke about the unrest.
It's basically the most recent escalation of a conflict that has been going on for decades and has involved many different players in the region. It's sometimes called Africa's World War, and it's been responsible in different times for the deaths of millions of people. And right now, millions of people in Congo are displaced. So it's a hugely significant conflict for that region. And, you know, it's the second biggest displacement crisis in the world. And the DRC itself is very rich in rare minerals, which are very useful to all of us there in our phones, in our computers. And what the UN has said in its report is that the M23 rebels are trying to exploit those minerals.
Western powers do not have an exact estimate of how much of the city has been taken over, but the Congolese army seems to have abandoned Goma. In the meantime, thousands of people are fleeing the violence. All right, coming up, we're going to meet a California family as they return to their wildfire-ravaged home for the first time, hoping to salvage any of their belongings. You're streaming CBS News 24/7. All residents impacted by the fires in Pacific Palisades are now allowed to briefly enter the burn area so they can survey what is left of their homes. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass is trying to reassure her constituents the city is moving as quickly as it can to boost the recovery process. CBS News Los Angeles reporter Tom Waite has more on how fire victims are coping.
That's it. Chuck Peel talking to his neighbors about his emotional return home. For the first time, all Palisades residents were officially allowed to come back. Peel lived here with his family on Bollinger for almost 2 decades.
For me, the house, that's one thing. It was a great little house, almost 18 years. But all the things inside that we lost, terrible. My dad's stuff, my mom's stuff from Africa, nothing, no pictures, all that.
Even in this, the darkest of moments, Peel is looking forward.
It's just about recovery. You know, now you just got to say, it's not about what you lost, but what did you find or where. That's the only way that I think I can process what's going on.
We're not rebuilding to have this happen again.
Exactly. KCAL News anchor Pat Harvey went to the Palisades to get answers about the timeline for rebuilding from LA Mayor Karen Bass and her newly tapped Chief Recovery Officer, real estate developer Steve Soberoff.
The question was when people said, I want to come back tomorrow and start rebuilding. Right. And you say, well, I'm going to get my own contractor. Yeah. But it has to be a contractor who has the requirements.
You can do that in phase 2.
Okay.
You cannot do that in phase 1.
Bass says once hazardous materials have been removed, homeowners will have 2 options for clearing the rest of the debris.
Once the toxics have been removed, then the owner has a choice. They can do it at no cost with the Army Corps of Engineers, or they can do it themselves.
This was my garage door.
For Peel and so many others, they're trying to move on from heartbreak and sorrow to figuring out how to rebuild.
The thing I'm really having a hard time, I just saw a neighbor looking for her cat, you know. What I'm struggling with is we really had a special street here on Bollinger.
And fire victims are clinging to moments like this. Peel's daughter capturing the moment when Peel's wife found treasure in the ash.
No way! Your wedding china!
Peel says he understands why so many Palisades residents were frustrated by having to wait for weeks to come home. But he says seeing the destruction for himself gave him perspective.
I saw when, you know, the president came and had a little bit of a standoff with Karen Bass, and, you know, you can understand both. Obviously, what he's saying, we all feel. We want to get in to see our house. We need closure. But it also has to be safe. I mean, these are buildings. Ours we can go into because there's nothing left, right? This side, it's all red tagged because it's partly, there's stuff about to collapse. What happens if they let us in officially too early and something falls on somebody they died? Then who's trouble?
That was CBS Los Angeles correspondent Tom Waite reporting for us. Let's bring in CBS News Philadelphia meteorologist Grant Gilmore with the last look at the national forecast. Hey, Grant.
Hey, Vlad, watching this Clipper system dropping in out of southern Canada, kind of clipping Minnesota, but moving through northern Wisconsin, the upper peninsula of Michigan out of Lake Superior. This will track to the south and east as we head through the next day or so, bringing not just snow, but gusty winds, sustained winds from 15 to 25 miles per hour, probably some gusts up to around 50 to nearly 60 miles per hour will come with some bursts of heavy snow. Some places, especially downwind of the Great Lakes, could see anywhere between 7 to 12 inches of snow, and all of that combined could reduce some visibility. Otherwise, mild conditions across the central United States. We've got dry weather across the southeast, 79 in Miami today, and a little rain and snow moving across the desert southwest. Vlad, back to you.
All right, Grant, thank you very much. That does it for me, folks. But stay right where you are after the break. Elizabeth Cook is live from San Francisco with all the news breaking coast to coast. This is CBS News 24/7.